Recording.
And this would be a good time for everyone to mute their phones if they have phones. Good evening. I'm Dan Tupper, District 3 Commissioner and President of the Board. I'm going to call us to order. This is a regular meeting of the Board of Commissioners for the Jefferson County Public Utility District. It is Tuesday, August 18th, 2020, and it is 5 p.m. Per the Governor's Extended Proclamation 2028 and in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, Jefferson County PUD is no longer providing an in-person room for meetings of the BOC. All meetings will be accessible remotely via WebEx until otherwise informed by the Governor. All participants' audio will be muted upon entry. Please unmute or mute at the appropriate time by using *6 on your telephone. With that, I would ask for introductions by the commissioners to determine that we have a quorum.
Kenneth Collins, Commissioner, District 2.
Jeff Randall, Commissioner, District 1.
So we have a full board tonight. Welcome, gentlemen. With that, we will move on to item number 2, which is the agenda review. If you notice, we have a little bit different agenda tonight. We have some new business items earlier in the agenda than normal. One is a legislative opportunity discussion, and the second is an FCS group revenue requirements presentation. So with that, is there any other additions to that part of the agenda or any part of the agenda tonight that we want to discuss at this point?
I have none.
I don't either. I'll move that we approve the agenda.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor of accepting the agenda as presented, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
It's unanimous. So with that, we will move on to item number 3, which is new business. And first up is 3.1, which is a legislative opportunity discussion with our U.S. House of Representatives, Washington District 6 Congressman Derek Kilmer. I'd like to welcome Congressman Kilmer on behalf of my fellow commissioners, our customer owners, the general manager and staff. I want to thank you for taking the time to speak at our board meeting tonight. Would also like to thank you for supporting our recent application for grant funding from the Department of Defense Community Infrastructure Program, and for your support of House Bill 7483. For those who are unaware, House Bill 7483 is also known as the Flexible Financing for Rural America Act of 2020. It was introduced in both House and Senate in July and would allow borrowers like Jefferson PUD to refinance their debt and take advantage of today's current low interest rates from the USDA Rural Utility Service Loan Program without incurring any fees or penalties. In 2013, Jefferson PUD borrowed over $115 million from RUS to purchase what was then an investor-owned utility and establish a public-owned utility within Jefferson County that would be owned and overseen by the citizens of the county. Many people questioned if we could do it, but we were successful, and we're proud of what we have accomplished over the past 7 years. Today, however, we still have more to accomplish. The ability to take advantage of today's record low interest rates would allow us to do much more for our community. Refinancing our RUS loan rate would allow the PUD to drop its existing interest rate from about 3% to nearly 1%. If successful, that would effectively reduce our interest payments by $1.5 million a year. That's $1.5 million a year that could go toward maintaining stable rates, building out our rural broadband, replacing outdated or aging infrastructure, and other projects or steps to expand or improve service to our customer owners during this especially trying time and well into the future. I'm sure that our customer owners and everyone at the PUD would be interested to hear what you could tell us about the status of HB 7483, what we could do to help it move forward in the coming months, and information that you could share about upcoming funding opportunities for rural broadband. Thanks again for your support and taking the time to speak with us this evening. And with that, Will, if you would bring Congressman Kilmer on, the floor is his.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, victory. Thank you.
Welcome.
I figure at 6 months into the pandemic, at some point I should stop celebrating when I successfully get onto a video conference, but it always feels like cause for celebration. thank you for having me, and more importantly, thank you for what you do. Appreciated that context for my visit, and really appreciate the PUD's leadership on all things, but particularly on this discussion around access to broadband. I'll start with the headline, which is I'm with you. I think, for too long we've seen that too many rural communities have really been left behind by our country's broadband infrastructure simply not reaching them. And as a representative of a whole bunch of rural communities who have struggled to get this access, it's been a real priority for me and for my team to make sure that we're making targeted investments to close the digital divide. I think while that's long been a challenge, it's been absolutely amplified during the coronavirus pandemic. Um, I think people are waking up to the notion that access to the internet is not just about whether you can watch the British baking show on Netflix, but rather, can your kids keep learning if school got canceled? And can a small business continue operating if their storefront got shut down? And can someone who was made unemployed apply for unemployment assistance? And um, I want to just recognize that um, these disparities that I've just discussed aren't new, but we know that given the changing landscape of work and education and telehealth and more, the urgency around these issues is really increased. You asked about the Flexible Financing for Rural America Act, HR 7483. So as you know, in order for borrowers to refinance their RUS loans, they need to first meet some narrow eligibility requirements and pay a penalty. And in response, this legislation, which is bicameral and bipartisan, was introduced, which would allow rural utility service providers to refinance RUS loans at a lower interest rates while waiving some of those related fees. Specifically, it would allow RUS borrowers of qualified loans to request rate adjustments that would be set at the rate determined by the date of enactment and based on the time remaining on the loan, and would allow RUS borrowers to request additional adjustments if necessary due to this pandemic, and it would waive all the fees associated with the borrower's request for adjustments. In light of the current coronavirus pandemic, I think you're right that this bill would represent a significant step toward cost saving for communities who need it the most. And so, with that in mind, one, I'm with you. I support the bill. I think you asked what could be done to try to see it move forward. You'll be glad to know that the discussions around access to broadband have definitely been moved closer to the front burner as a consequence of this pandemic. And I would just encourage, you all have done a great job of reaching out to your elected officials, as you engage with others who work in this space, other public utilities, your state association, and even the national associations that engage on this issue. I would encourage your colleagues in other parts of the state and other parts of the country to be sure that they're reaching out to their elected officials as well about this bill. Um, Even beyond this bill, there's a lot that is happening in the rural broadband space. I serve on the Appropriations Committee. In the fiscal year 2021 bill that we recently moved out of committee, we saw a substantial increase in funding for rural broadband. Um, we were able to put over $1 billion, an increase of 435 million over the previous year for the expansion of broadband in rural communities, including nearly $1 billion for the Reconnect program. That's funding to make a real difference in improving rural communities' outcomes for health and education and economic opportunity. I'm also a sponsor of a bill that I'm hoping can be included in infrastructure bill. It's a bill called the Broadband for All Act. Um, that's a bill that focuses primarily on kind of the last mile or the last few mile issues. It's a bipartisan bill, and it would use the tax code. It would create refundable tax credits for neighborhoods, for businesses who team up to build the infrastructure that connects them to existing rural broadband service. But that's again oriented sort of towards the last mile or last few mile issue. I'm also a co-sponsor of a bill called the Rural Broadband Acceleration Act. That's a bill that directs the Federal Communications Commission to fund shovel-ready, high-speed internet projects immediately so that consumers can access broadband within a year. It's a bipartisan bill led by two very senior leaders in Congress, Jim Clyburn, who's a Democrat, and Fred Upton, who's a Republican. And the goal is to accelerate the deployment of funds to bidders in the upcoming Rural Digital Opportunity Fund if they commit to building a gigabit tier broadband network, if they commit to beginning construction within 6 months of receiving funding, and if they commit to providing internet service within a year. So that is another bill worth taking a look at. And then there's also a bill called the Accessible Affordable Internet for All Act. I'm a sponsor of that as well. That would basically provide a whole lot of money. It would invest $100 billion broadly focused on bridging the digital divide, helping to build broadband infrastructure in unserved areas and underserved communities, and working to make sure that the resulting internet service is affordable. I'll just mention a couple other quick things because I may have already spoken longer than you wanted me to, and then I'm happy to take some questions if you have them. In the specific kind of pandemic response bills, you've already seen some effort in this regard. The CARES Act included funding for USDA rural development grant programs for distance learning and telemedicine grants, which can fund software and equipment for distance learning or telemedicine, and the Reconnect broadband grants, which fund construction of improvement of broadband service facilities. The CARES Act also included some funding to the VA to support increased telework and telehealth within the VA, and also some funding for rural hospitals to address telehealth. And then there was also funding in the CARES Act, $1.5 billion to the Economic Development Administration, focused on recovery plans, but among the resiliency efforts that could be funded through the EDA, and our regional EDA has put out some grant availability, is resiliency efforts around that could include construction of upgrades to public infrastructure, including broadband. Far more robust is the HEROES Act, which has passed the House but has not yet passed the Senate. And that HEROES Act included $5 billion for the FCC's E-rate program for schools and libraries to provide internet service to students and to teachers, with again prioritizing folks that are currently left behind. The HEROES Act also entitles households in which a member has been laid off or furloughed to get a $50 benefit or a $75 benefit on tribal lands to put toward the monthly price of internet service during the COVID-19 public health emergency. And then the providers would be reimbursed. So that is, I flagged that for you because that could come to pass, and that's worth taking a look at for all of you. The HEROES Act also requires that Lifeline providers make unlimited minutes and unlimited data available to those that rely on the Lifeline program to stay connected to phone or internet service and provide additional support. And then finally, the HEROES Act included $2 billion for a temporary expansion of the FCC's rural healthcare program to partially subsidize their healthcare providers' broadband service. So I know that was a lot, and we know that there's still more that needs to be done on this front. I am very committed to this. I think it's just fundamentally important, and eager to hear if you've got questions or other priorities that you want to flag. But really, let me end where I started with, which is with gratitude to the PUD for your leadership and for your partnership. And certainly we want to be on the home team here.
Thank you, Congressman. That was a very comprehensive update. At this point, I don't think we have any specific amount of time set aside, but we're going to make the most of having you here, I think.
Sure,
Commissioners, staff, if you guys want to interject. Anyone? Any questions?
I'll just make a comment. This is Jeff Randall, representing the Port Townsend District, Commissioner for the PUD. And Representative Kilmer, I appreciate your support for these infrastructure legislation and funding, we're finding that we, in this COVID time, we have really limited tools for economic development and trying to be more resilient. We're finding that the county and the city have reduced funding due to reduction in sales tax revenue and other revenue sources that they would normally get through tourism and sales. And the PUD, because we exist, is a major potential tool in helping things. So I think that's how we're trying to approach it. And we're a fairly new PUD, so we're trying to learn to ride the bicycle and chew gum at the same time. We've been at it for a while and we've been pretty successful. And I think we're going to try and make our broadband a priority because we are seeing the funding becoming available, and hopefully it will continue to be available in the coming years. And you're dead on right. This COVID situation has really amplified the need and amplified the places that don't have it. And I think we're all kind of seeing that this may be the most important economic development issue for us in this time, given our location. We can't change our location. We can't move ourselves closer to I-5, but this is a major infrastructure issue for both businesses, individuals, people trying to work from home or get benefits, and kids' education with not knowing when school will ever be back the way it was again. So thank you for the support, and thank you for the kind of strategic advice in reaching out to other PUDs who have their own representatives who may be on the other side of the aisle from you and who perhaps could be very helpful in moving these things forward.
I really appreciate it, Commissioner. And let me just say, part of the value of this is, and I've consistently bristled when I've heard the media refer to what Congress has done so far as stimulus. I don't think that's actually accurate, right? What Congress has done so far is to try to stop the bleeding. At some point, we need to do something about stimulus, right? Because the economy's on the ground right now. And to me, one of the smartest things we can do is these investments in infrastructure, and specifically broadband infrastructure, because not only would it put people to work in the short term, but it can lay the foundation for economic opportunity over the long term. And if you care about inclusive economic development and inclusive economic growth, and I do, then this is where it's at. And so we've been banging that drum in Washington, D.C. and trying to elevate this issue for a long time. And, I really appreciate your partnership in that regard.
Congressman Kilmer, this is Kenneth Collins, District 2 Commissioner. I really appreciate your making yourself available to dialogue with us. Obviously, you get it. You understand the importance of funding for the last mile, that for rural and semi-rural areas is, I think, a huge challenge. And let me add a couple of points. In addition to being a PUD commissioner, I'm also a healthcare provider who's been using telemedicine in order to work with clients for long distance therapy. And I will tell you from my experience that having a 10-1 connection, having a 25-3 connection is grossly inadequate. It means having the screen freeze on a regular basis, having a voice garbled. It's frustrating. It's an impediment to delivering a needed service. So I'm very appreciative of the efforts that you have made, the legislation that you've introduced. I think about $100 billion ought to do it. But
it'd be a good start, Commissioner.
It'd be a good start. It'd be a very good start.
Yeah.
And the last thing I want to say is, while we are all committed to improving broadband, making it available, I also personally appreciate your efforts to keep the Postal Service going.
Amen. Yeah. Well, let me say a couple things on the topics that you raised. To me, the work you're doing around around access to broadband, and not just access to internet, but quality, affordable, reliable. It's really important. I mean, one of the most memorable moments I've had in this job, I represent a district that includes 11 Native American tribes. And I was meeting with one of the tribal leaders and I said, how's it going? And he said, you want the good news or the bad news? And I said, well, tell me the good news. He said, every one of our high school seniors graduated this year. And I said, that's great. I said, what's the bad news? He said, well, for the first time, the state of Washington is requiring our students take the state mandated exam over the internet. He said, Derek, we don't have high-speed internet. He said, we did a sample test. It's one of those you answer 10 questions and click next page. He said, we timed it. It took 1 minute and 44 seconds to get to the next page. He said, so that's not going to work. So we're going to end up busing our kids to a school they've never been to, for some of our kids to a town they've never been to. And that gets beyond whether you can watch Stranger Things on Netflix, right? Like that is, do you have educational opportunity and do you have economic opportunity? And for far too many people, the answer to that is no, they don't. And so, that is, it really matters the work you're doing and the advocacy that you're undertaking. And I can't say anything more emphatically than just, we're on the home team. I will do my oars in the water rowing by your side on this because it really matters. On the Postal Service, I'll be hopping on a plane later this week. The House will be voting on a bill to unwind some of the damage done by this administration, by the Postmaster General. They've proposed operational and organizational changes that are really eroding the quality of service. Now, the Postmaster General announced today that they would stop implementing those changes, but he didn't say anything about unwinding the damage that's already been done, and the bill that we're putting forward would do that as well. Would basically restore service at the level pre-pandemic and provide the funding to ensure that they can do that. We may have already posted on my Facebook page, but we will soon, so I'm not telling any tales out of school. But earlier today we did kind of a Facebook event with the Sunrise Coffee Company, with the team there, and their proprietor said, listen, we've already seen a decline in service. We've seen delays in shipments. He said, for the first time in our entire time of doing business, we had a late delivery sticker put on our door. So that's concerning because small businesses need the Postal Service to function. I heard from a veteran down in Grays Harbor who relies on the Postal Service for his prescriptions, and he's terrified. He said, if we see a lapse in service, this is life or death stuff for me. And not to mention the fact that this really gets at the integrity of our electoral system and the ability to vote by mail, particularly important during a global pandemic. And so I'm really concerned about this. Certainly they felt the heat and I think are backing away from some of these changes, at least before the election. But we got to undo this damage too. And as Bill from the Sunrise Coffee Company said, they're already seeing the impacts of that damage.
So staff, do you have any questions for the congressman?
I don't have any questions. I would like to thank him for taking time out of his schedule to come in and talk to us. Broadband is a big issue, and I appreciate everything he said. So thank you very much.
You bet. We got your back.
And Congressman, I did have one question on 7483. When you kind of read that, it kind of calls out more like it's cooperatives and municipals. I mean, will public utility districts definitely be captured in that legislation?
That was our read on it, but we can double check with the lead sponsor. That was our read on it. But I'll take that as a to-do following this call. And if we find out otherwise, we can both work with the sponsor and also circle back with you all.
Yeah, because broadband's a big issue, but $1.5 million a year more in our budget gives us a lot more stuff we can accomplish if we can make that happen.
Amen.
So with anyone else at this point, want to chime in real quick? We got a couple minutes here, maybe. All right, with that, I'd also like to say thank you, Congressman, for your time tonight and very comprehensive discussion.
You bet. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the great work you do, too. Count me as a partner.
Thank you. Thanks,
All right.
Congressman.
Thank you. So with that, we will move on to item 3.2, presentation from SCS on revenue requirements. Kevin, did you want to do some introductions? I know that Sergey is going to be able to control the presentation.
I'll just give a plug for FCS. They have been great to work with. They've spent a lot of time with staff. I just appreciate everything Sergey and Paul have done for us. Angie, it's just been, we feel very lucky that they're working on this project for us. So thank you. And Sergey, go for it.
Thank you, Kevin. Really appreciate it. It's been great to work with the PUD on this project as well. Can everybody hear me okay and see the presentation on the screen? Great. Well, good evening, everybody. As Kevin mentioned, my name is Sergey Tarasov, the project manager with FCS Group. And with me, I have Angie Sanchez-Bernache. She's the principal on the project, as well as Paul Quinn, who's the technical lead performing the analysis on this project as well. So they'll be available and they'll be contributing to the presentation as well. So as a quick presentation overview, we're going to go over the quick recap. What have we done so far in the study? We'll get into the overview of the overall rate study process just to get everybody back on the same track. We had a presentation recently kind of going over concepts. So we wanted to get everybody back on track in terms of what we're doing here today. And then we'll get into some of the common key assumptions that went into the analysis, and then dive into each individual utility, discussing the results of that first step of the overall study process, the revenue requirement. Now, excuse me. Now today, we will be going over preliminary findings for both utilities. This is just to show you what we're seeing and also receive feedback from you based on your observations and thoughts in terms of the strategy that we're implementing. So again, these are just preliminary findings, and we would like to fine tune them based on the results of the meeting today. So as a quick recap, we started the study with the PUD in April of this year. We've been working on the analysis in detail quite a bit with staff, and we met initially with you, the board, to go over rate setting fundamental concepts and go over internal goals and objectives of the study on July 13th. Since then, we have formalized an initial draft for both the water and electric divisions and utilities. And that's why we're here today to present initial findings to you. In the meantime, we've also been working on the remaining steps, but again, today's focus is just that first step. So to get everybody back on track, grounded in terms of just the big picture concept of what is a rate study, we wanted to bring back this graphic, which shows the three-step process of a typical rate study, which starts with overall needs in step one. So here, what we call it typically revenue requirement. And again, what we're trying to accomplish here is identify how much revenue we need to bring in to meet our ongoing obligations. Basically, we're testing if our rates today are sufficient to meet our needs, be that debt service, operating maintenance expenses, capital, fiscal policies. We just need to make sure we're meeting our needs, not only today, but into the future as well. So if you think of step one as a pie, step two breaks that pie into slices and looks at equity. Do cost differences exist to provide service to residential customers versus commercial customers? And if so, are our current rates equitable between our classes? And then finally, step three uses the information from the first two steps and develops the fixed and variable charges applicable to all customers. So today's focus, as you can kind of see on the chart on the upper left, will be that step one, the revenue requirement. So in terms of the key assumptions that were applicable to all utilities, on this slide you'll find some of the major ones. The study period we'll be discussing is 2020 through 2030. So we're looking at the budget year 2020, followed by a forecast of 10 years through 2030. For expense purposes, we are using the current fiscal year or 2020 budget for fiscal year for power purposes and calendar year for expense purposes for operating maintenance expenses. As the baseline, we did go over it in quite a bit of detail. It was staff, making sure we're not forecasting any one-time costs into the future, or we're not missing any costs that were potentially not around in the current budget year, but might be present in the future forecast year. So again, we spent quite a bit of time going over those. The one big assumption for our, pretty much assumption for our analysis is that any tax revenues or fund balances that the PD had at the beginning of this year are allocated and only eligible to be applied towards the electric utility and the broadband side of it. Those funds and revenues are not eligible for the water division. So that's a pretty substantial item that will be impacting some of the results we'll be showing you. And then finally, unless otherwise specified, any future debt we're assuming for our scenarios we're going to show you today are in terms of revenue bonds with a 20-year term, 5% interest rate, and 1.25% issuance cost. The interest rate is most likely high, as you just heard, based on recent historic lows. But again, we're forecasting 10 years out. There's a lot of uncertainty that may occur between now and the next 10-year period. So we're being a little bit conservative, especially in the short term, but mainly focusing when the debt comes in the longer term for utilizing that 5% rate. Just as a quick refresher, these are the policies currently adopted for the PUD. We went over them in a little bit of detail during our fundamentals discussion, but just as a refresher, we are incorporating 3 key policies. One is in regards to working capital reserve, and this is basically this reserve is meant to act as kind of as a liquidity cushion for the fluctuation of revenues coming in during peak period times, such as the winter time for the electric utility when you have peak revenues, versus the milder months, such as the shoulder months of April, springtime period, as well as the fall time period, where you might not be getting as much revenue in the door, and misalignment with expenses going out. So again, we need to make sure we have enough cash on hand for those purposes, as well as seasonal fluctuations. You might have an average year, you might have a below average mild year, where as a whole in a year you might not generate enough revenues. We want to be able to go into reserves instead of having an immediate rate action necessary to come up with our cash needs. So current policy is 90 days or 3 months of operating expenses and power in the case of the electric utility. Here we're looking at $7.2 million for 2020 approximately, and based on our forecast, estimating the need to have about $9.3 million for that electric utility in 2030. On the water side, we're looking at $731,000 up to almost $1 million in that 10-year forecast. The second reserve is related to the capital contingency. Again, this is for unplanned anticipated capital or emergency repairs. This is not for catastrophic events. And the current target is actually a new target. It was established at about $100,000 total this year in 2020. And the maximum target is 50% of annual capital, which we're trying to phase in, balancing again rate action and complying with policies in through 2025. So again, we're making sure that it's not putting a lot of pressure on rates directly, but we are trying to build it up slowly over time to have enough reserves on hand to meet that policy. And that'll range from that 100,000 combined. We split it 80,000 electric, 20,000 water. And building up, tying it to directly the capital needs of each utility gets up to about $2.5 million over that horizon and stays at that level through the end of the 10-year period for the electric utility, and then about $280,000 for the water utility. And finally, the final coverage requirements, you can think of it more as a legal requirement technically for the existing debt that we have through RUS for the electric utility. It does come with 4 coverage and tier requirements. It has a standard debt service coverage and tier requirement and a target of a ratio of about 1.25, 1.25, and then a coverage and tier operating requirement of 1.1. So we're tracking all 4 metrics, making sure that we're not only meeting our cash flow sufficiency on an annual basis, but also complying with all 4 of the ratios on an annual basis. And we'll show you our forecast results of those when we get to the electric utility. So before I dive into the water utility, any questions so far? Okay, and we can always come back as we go through.
I do have a question, Sergey.
Oh, sure.
Looking at what you had suggested for borrowing via revenue bonds, which, if I'm understanding correctly, would have a total cost of 6.25%.
No, so the issuance cost is just the cost of going through the FA process. It's kind of an adder to the balance, and then the interest rate would be applied on the total. So the interest rate would be about 5%.
Okay. Did you identify other potential sources of funding that the PUD could take advantage of that would be perhaps at a lower interest rate than and less complicated for us than issuing bonds?
So typically you could find low interest loans like drinking water loans for the water utility, public works loans for the water utility. Those, the funding for those is very sparse, especially these days. So for modeling purposes, we're being conservative for this initial discussion. So we wanted to see what is the cost of the most extreme case, what's the most expensive case for borrowing, and then we'll show you kind of based on that, this is kind of the upper ceiling. And then if we can secure any lower interest financing, that would just be a positive in terms of a financial picture. But right now, we always hesitate modeling any kind of low interest financing unless it's in hand, because those funding sources are so limited by the state, and it would be tough to predict in terms of the availability.
I have a follow-up question to what Ken just brought up, and it just kind of ticked it, Sergey, your comment about knowing that whatever model you pick is a sure thing. And this is a question back to Joel and Kevin, because I think we brought this up at a previous meeting when we were looking at the water budget. Because the water side, even though we're anticipating some need for additional revenue because of some of the points you brought up, like the property taxes and so forth, and I think the rates in general have not been covering that side of the division. However, the budget for the water side is much smaller than the budget for the So given our reserves, Joel and Kevin, could we not lend ourselves the money, basically lend the money from the electric side to the water side to make the, and I think our goal is to absolutely get the water rates where the water side is covering itself, but could we do it over time and not take such a big hit? And I realize this is the beginning of the conversation, not the end. So could we lend ourselves the money?
I guess I'll start. The short answer is yes, you can.
And you'll see a recommendation later in the presentation.
Yeah, there's no problem with that. The problem is spending property tax funds on water department services and programs.
Correct.
Just can't do that. So.
Got it. Okay, so just something to know. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And precisely, some of the scenarios that we're developing for your view today will include the inter-fund lending or interdivisional lending that we'll go over. All right. So we'll start out the discussion with the water utility, water division. So as you may remember during our fundamentals discussion, so the key components of the revenue requirement include revenues, operating maintenance expenses, capital, debt service, and they come all together to make the revenue requirement. So we wanted to provide you a little bit of detail here, starting with the water utility components, including the revenue side. So here, for our forecast purposes, we did review the detailed customer statistics for both water and electric utilities. Here, we are utilizing 2019 detailed customer data to forecast our analysis into the future. Based on our discussions and review of information, the water system is fairly built out. So at this point, for revenue purposes, we're not assuming any growth in revenue. So at current levels, it'll strictly be at current levels, no new customers connecting on an annual basis on average. Including rate revenue, we're also looking at non-rate revenue sources, which include interest income. Because we are tracking LUD debt service, we are also showing the LUD revenue towards that debt service. Since so certain areas will be paying in additional funds to pay for that debt, we are tracking. And if you look at the graphical representation down below, you'll notice the yellow portion of the revenue bar shows the annual contribution related to the LED revenues, and you can see they go away in our forecast by 2026. Now, our analysis does include a one-time 2021 timber harvest revenue from Peterson Lake of about $500,000. So again, looking at the graphical representation of revenues, you'll see a big blip increase in 2021 revenues, and then it goes back down. Because again, that's the actual harvest of timber during that year. It's a one-time source of funds, and then it goes away. That's why you can kind of see that volatility in the bars below. And finally, for our initial baseline discussion, we are assuming that the water division includes the sewer utility. So right now, everything we're talking about includes the sewer. So it includes the sewer revenues, the sewer expenses, and sewer capital as well. So overall, you'll notice that our revenues at current levels before any adjustment discussion range from about $3.5 million to about $2.8 million. On the expenses side, as I mentioned in the introduction, we are using 2020 budget as a starting point and escalating into the future with various escalation factors ranging from 2 to 6%. These include general cost inflation, labor cost inflation, as well as benefits. So here, our weighted average inflation rate from 2020 through 2030 is approximately 3.2%. So once we apply all those factors by individual line item expense, account for any one-time costs, our average annual inflation is about 3.2%. Now we are tracking and forecasting PUD's actual usage for water and electricity and treating it as an expense in the budget. I believe this is a new process that has started to occur this year, especially for the electric utility already in June, and will also commence for the water utility. So we're making sure we're accounting for those expenses appropriately. And finally, we are tracking a share of our labor related to capital and assuming it'll be capitalized, and we're moving it to the capital funding side. So right now your budget included total labor. We're taking out a portion of labor that'll be capitalized, and we're treating it and tracking it as part of our capital costs, which we'll be discussing in the next couple of slides. In total, you can see our O&M is about $3 million. I apologize, and I didn't put the combined total number, but if you add up all the components that are driven by distribution being the top component, about $1.6 million in the current year, followed by A&G, administrative and general expenses, and then a combination of customer accounting, service, taxes, and power costs make up about $3 million in 2020, and they do increase to about $4.0 million. In terms of capital, we do have quite extensive capital list that was formed using information from the PD as well as the water system plan that the PD is performing right now. So it includes an all-inclusive list reviewed by staff and modified as best as possible at this time. So here you're looking at a capital plan that's about $13.8 million in today's dollars, but we are inflating it because we are projecting into the future with 3% annual inflation. So that plan gets increased to about $16.4 million through that 10-year horizon. And again, just as a reminder, it does include the sewer portion of the capital. There are a couple of projects here that are assumed to be funded by either an LED, the developer contribution, or grant funding. So you'll notice a couple of projects at the bottom, the Shine Plat and Bywater Shine Plat, about $445,000. And then there's also an assumption for a grant for the cool seam storage tank design of about $261,000. You'll notice the cool seam area has a $2 million in 21. That's the assumption for that tank. So we are making an assumption that that tank will be built with low interest loans of about 2% interest at this time. So as we get to the scenarios, and I'll bring this up again, we are including that cost, but we are, based on our internal discussions, we're going to assume it'll require funding, and it most likely qualifies for low interest financing. So for this specific loan, we'll be assuming low interest financing. All other debt will be assuming revenue bonds.
So Sergey or Kevin, does this mirror our 10-year water plan?
Yes.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yes, it incorporates the 10-year water plan. There are some projects that are still being under review, but it does include the water plan.
Thank you.
Okay. So when we put all those components together, here you'll find a graphical representation of the revenue requirement. And what we're seeing here are the bars representing expenses made up of a dark gray color at the bottom, which shows the operating maintenance expenses. The golden color in the middle, or the yellow color, shows the existing general debt, and then the LED debt in the blue at the top. And you can kind of see the LED debt drops off. And these bars are compared to the revenues at current levels. Now here, the orange line shows total revenues, and again, it goes down because that LED share revenue goes away. And then that blip in 21, again, is due to that Peterson Lake timber harvest. So if we compare the line, especially in 2020 and beyond, to the bars, we see that our rates at current levels are not sufficient to meet our ongoing operating expenses. And the key frame here is that this is strictly focusing on the operating side. This does not include the capital component yet, which we'll be discussing on the next slide. So what this is saying is that we can meet our operating expenses. We can't meet our debt service, general debt service in year 1. By year 3, we're not even able to meet our operating expenses. Based on our brief discussion regarding the tax balances, the water utility started the year without those balances. Started 2020 at pretty much zero balance. As we saw in the prior slide, since we don't have enough balances available to pay for O&M and debt service, we don't have any fund balances available to meet our capital needs. So you can see that our projection would become negative. We're not be able to not only comply with our reserve targets, we will not be able to construct any projects outside of before, with the current rate strategy. So what that tells us is that we need to either borrow funds, have rate adjustments, which we'll be talking about on the next slide. So for your initial consideration, I would like you to keep in mind that because there's so many ways that we can address our needs, for the initial consideration, we wanted to bring back 2 scenarios to start the discussion, and wanted to hear from you what your thoughts were. We brought back 2 scenarios. Both scenarios are looking at borrowing from the electric division. So both options 1, scenario 1 and scenario 2 are looking at an interfund loan from the electric side. The first approach basically looks at what do we need to make us whole through 2020 to help us build the capital we identified, to help us cover operating costs and debt service. And then starting in 2021, this utility can become self-sufficient. That's option 1. And this option would require a $1.6 million estimated transfer from the electric division. Scenario 2 looks at, well, what happens if we want to allow the water utility to transition into the rate strategy that they need to meet over time. So instead of having all in 1 year self-sufficiency in 2021, let's say we allow the water division to do it over a multiple year period. So in this case, we're increasing our interfund loan from the electric division up to $5 million. So here we are assuming that the loan will take will be repaid over 10 years. So it's a 10-year term, and they will have a 2% interest rate for our assumptions. So there is a cost associated with this repayment to the electric division. Now, the bigger the loan, I want you to keep in mind, the bigger the impact to the water division as well, because now you have to raise your rates high enough to repay a bigger loan to the interfund loan. Now, if you look at the table below, you'll see a summary of new debt assumptions. For both of these scenarios, we are assuming we're going to need to borrow to meet our plan that we have identified a couple of slides ago. So the first year, the 1.6 and the 5 million are representative of the borrowing from the electric division. Starting year 2 in 2021 and thereafter, pretty much every other year, we're showing the estimated amount of borrowing that may need to happen to construct the capital program that we have identified. And besides that initial $2.2 million for the coal seam storage tank, which we're assuming at a low interest loan, everything else is assumed utilizing a revenue bond.
So a couple questions.
Okay.
First, does the electric side have $5 million to lend? That would be the first question. What would that do to our tier and our operating and capital budget on that side? And again, I realize those electric customers are also our water customers. So is there a chance that if we do a loan, do we have to attach a percentage of interest to it, or could that be a no interest loan? That would be my two questions. I mean, I hate to charge people 2% on their own money, basically. I know we can reinvest that money and be getting a return as the electrical side, but I just curious how that could work.
So I'll try to answer those questions. So in terms of the funds amounts, we'll show you the scenario that impact these options on electric utility once we get to the electric section. But the short answer is yes, there's sufficient funds in that utility to provide an interfund loan up to $5 million. And in terms of the interest rate, that we would have to really double check with legal and accounting here. But historically, based on my understanding, is that even for interfund loans, you are required to charge an interest rate for those proceeds. But again, we'll want to double check with either legal or accounting on that one.
And I just want to chime in with what Dan is bringing up. You know, some interest rate may not equal 2%. So that's where I'm in total agreement with Dan. We should not be charging our customers fees if we don't have to. So Joel, you know, put your thinking cap on, and whatever is sound and okay, but keeping it to a minimum is what I would ask also.
I would say I don't have the exact answer on this sitting here today, but I will get you the answer for what I think. Sergey is right that you need to apply some amount of interest on an interfund loan, but let me dial down on that and see exactly what would be required. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So what does this actually mean in terms of scenarios on our rates? On the next slide, you'll see a percentage and a dollar representation of the strategy. Again, this is just preliminary summary scenarios as we're fine-tuning to the final approach based on our discussion with you. For scenario 1, where we go with a $1.6 million interfund loan, and then a self-sufficiency action in 21, you're going to look at a 34% increase followed by a 17%. Now, the reason why there's another bigger one in 22, if you remember a couple of slides ago, there is that one-time revenue source in 21 that's allowing us to transition our rates over 2 years. So because we have that $500,000 timber harvest this year, we don't need to go all the way to meet our deficiency this year. But because that revenue source is a one-time source and it goes away, then we become deficient again. And that's why there's a back-to-back rate action required in this scenario. After that, the following increases are a combination of debt service and keeping up with cost inflation on the operating side. So they're a little under 5% per year. On the scenario 2 with a higher borrowing, now we have a bigger just overall payment, even excluding interest in this assumption for the $5 million is just a bigger number that we have to repay over 10 years on an annual basis. So overall, we have a bigger cost to repay. Then stack on top of that the same needs that we have in scenario 1 for the capital plan. We are able to transition this rate strategy and smooth it out a little bit down to about 13% per year for the next 5 years. After that, it's a little bit, again, more expensive. The reason for that is with higher upfront increases, you generate cash faster, you start accruing reserves faster, you earn interest on that cash. So anytime we have higher front-end increases, most of the time you're going to see in the short term it's more expensive. In the longer term, it's going to be a little bit cheaper because of those factors that I just mentioned. So you'll see a cumulative impact that is higher on the transitionary strategy, but on the front end, it does provide a little bit of a alleviation if you think about it in that way. Now, in terms of a rate, the average rate right now for a typical residential home using 4,200 gallons, which is about the average for the utility, is about $37.83. With these adjustments, depending on which scenario you're looking at, it'll go up anywhere from $12 for the first year for that one-time big adjustment, and the $8 the following year, and then after that inflationary level, not inflationary level, more around $3 level increases thereafter. And then the $5 million scenario is looking like $5 per month per year, up to $8 before dropping back down around $4 or $5 thereafter. In both of these scenarios, we are trying to smooth them out as much as we can with the funds available. So you'll see a note here, we are using reserves to cover deficiencies in either option. So in option one, we're using about $700,000 of this $1.6 million for that shortage of O&M and debt service, and the remaining is going to pay for capital. In scenario two, $4.1 million of that $5 million is helping us in those shortages basically through 2025 to allow for that smoother transition up to that peak need that we need to be able to support as a standalone utility. So again, we're using basically these fund balances to help us transition to these rate strategies.
So Sergey, was there methodology of the 1.6 and the 5 million? Was there a Goldilocks scenario in between there anywhere that made sense, or?
It all depends on, these are just the boundaries of, meeting our obligations. The logic on the first scenario was just self-sufficiency as soon as possible. Option two, we're trying to balance overall impact and transitioning the rates as much as we can. And this is kind of where we felt that it was as low as we can go with, as much debt as we can go, because we are relying pretty heavily on debt. We had our discussion on the fundamental side about seeing if we can be more pay as you go, especially for electric utility. But here we're relying pretty heavily on debt because we are so behind, and because we are trying to account for, I want to say, affordability, because if we rely on cash more, these percentages would be even higher.
So Sergey, I have a question too. One of the assumptions you stated at the very beginning, and this is a question for Kevin also, is that the growth in customers was assumed to be zero.
Right.
And that surprises me a little bit, even if it were just a handful of customers. Kevin, how many new hookups are we seeing a year? And are we seeing this at the same time, so that truly we're seeing no growth in our water side number of customers?
Jeff, we are seeing very small growth. Where we do see growth will be, maybe the Shine Plat, but the costs associated with them kind of offset the growth. So,
right, yeah,
it's a catch-22.
When we take on a new system, it comes with a bunch of costs that get spread to everybody else. Okay, then the second point, this isn't a question, it's an observation, and I think your overall presentation, Sergey, could be seen as very dire and very scary as we're looking at it. In my opinion, the saving grace is that average cost currently $37. So when we look at these percentages, they're scary and they're big, but when you look at real dollars, the good news is we have a low rate now. So and you're pointing out that it's too low. It's not covering the costs of the system over time. So I think when we talk about these numbers, it's going to be really important that we, there probably needs to be percentages shown in there, but I think we should talk about them in terms of dollars.
Okay.
Real dollars. These increases are modest. They're very modest. And I think another thing that would be helpful when we get to a point when we're making decisions and when we're sharing this information with the public on the decisions we've made is to have some comparable numbers from other rural utilities, water utilities of similar scope and scale, so that people who maybe not that long ago were paying for their own well or whatever, and they just are kind of having perhaps their own little bit of sticker shock with Jefferson PUD water rates, they're seeing what water rates are elsewhere, and hopefully ours are very much in line, or we may even be on the low end. So I think there'll be an educational component, but that's my point, is that we're fortunate that our rates are so low to begin with. That's all I'm going to say. And it's interesting to see that, if, as you point out, if you take a more aggressive line up front, it does save people money over time, that we end up with a lower rate in the end if we just get the pain over with and start the rates a little higher initially. Thank you.
And those are great points. We actually do have a comparison of neighboring utilities, what a typical bill under this level will look like there. So we'll show you that in a couple of slides. Great. We also wanted to test the sensitivity of separating the sewer utility on its own. Again, this is a site analysis we briefly discussed during the fundamentals. There was some potential question about it. This is just more informational for you. So right now, as a reminder, the baseline scenarios that you're seeing here on the water scenario slide, because sewer is embedded, is along with the water utility, these increases would be applicable to the sewer utility as well. The other question you can ask is, well, what if sewer starts to meet its own obligations? Because based on our initial review, we saw that they were behind. So we ran two additional scenarios for the sewer utility. One looked at self-sufficiency starting 2021, and one looked at phasing them in over 5 years, just to give you some degree of impact. And what we found is that the sewer utility would require pretty much a 200% adjustment in 1 year, followed by inflationary rates thereafter. So again, 1 year to get us in order, and then after that, because costs are increasing, we would just go along with inflation of 2.5% thereafter. And then scenario 2 would look at transitioning there over 5 years. So you can see 25 cents per year plus compounding, followed by more 8%. Again, that compounding will have the same type of impact you saw on the prior slide, where if we have the front end increase, the short term will be more expensive, but in the long term, it'll be less expensive. Now, again, this is just a side scenario. So as you mentioned, Commissioner Randall, that if we're starting with a low base, sometimes percentages are a lot scarier. Again, in this case, 200% or dollars will be pretty high as well of a jump. But as we'll see on the comparative slide on the next slide, it might put you more in line with what other utilities are charging for sewer service as well. So here you have a standard rate. You also have a separate CaliPoint rate and a discount rate, but right now your most common standard rate is $30.80. Depending on which option you go with, if you go this route, then it may go up as high as $90 to $100 the next couple of years, or transition more around $70 to up to $15, $18 increases per year. So those comparatives, we always caution that these are not always apples and oranges, or apples and apples comparisons. These could be apples and oranges because every utility is different, and some utilities are more rural than others. Some have different topographical requirements or treatment requirements. So it's always hard to do a straight line comparison of these rates. Some embed their taxes in their bill, some do it on top of their bill. So we try our best to capture that, but I'm pretty sure there's a couple of utilities that might have additional taxes that they charge differently. But in general, this should give you an overall idea of what your rates are today in relation to your neighbors. So here we've looked at Port Angeles, Mason PD1, Port Townsend, and Clallam PUD Fairview. The Clallam PUD currently has several different areas, and they're currently consolidating all their rates into a one rate approach. So the Fairview is I believe, is the most representative of all the rates. Plus, over a couple of years, they're all going to be the same as well. So right now, Jefferson PUD's current rate, as you mentioned, is quite a bit lower than everybody else's, which could also highlight why we're slightly behind our needs. But again, we're only looking at how do we compare today versus what others are charging today. And I know that working with some of these utilities, they are also, or at least they were before COVID, evaluating other rate action going into the future. So it's not like these utilities will remain at these levels most likely they will be adjusting their rates going into the future as well as their costs go up.
I would like to comment, going back to what Commissioner Randall said. I think it would be useful for the board to see a broader comparison using benchmarks that really are comparable sized PUDs. I think that would give us presumably a greater sense of comfort if in fact we are below other PUDs that are similarly situated. And this is not, I would like more information for us.
Yeah, and I would agree with Ken there too. I think you've done a great job with catching kind of the regional jurisdictions that are similar to us. But even if you could find, say, 2 PUDs of similar size and scale with water customers, and I know that we're an odd one, so you may have a hard time, but I think I would agree with Ken. If regardless of where they are, if we could find even a couple more that are like us to show that we're trying to be as fair and with our information and as objective as possible.
Sure. We'll definitely look at looking at the list. We started with your neighbors first, but we can definitely expand. Again, we'll try to keep it more consistent, not only to the size, but the nature in terms of we will want to be as alike as possible. We don't want to have a big population center that's all densely populated, the same type of utility. Because it's totally different how you operate one utility versus a different one.
Yeah, along this line of questions here, I'll jump ahead a little bit. Your next slide as well. I think we need to definitely break out when we do those comparisons. Sewer systems have different dynamics and different costs than the septic type of systems that we have. So I think it would be nice you're kind of comparing apples and oranges when we do that, because there's going to be capital surcharges, user fees, hookup fees that maybe we don't necessarily have. So I think the more granular you can get on those other systems. So it's going to be hard to find someone that's similar to us, I believe, in the way we do things in the systems we have. So if we can break that out on those other systems a little more granularly, it's definitely going to help us. And I think another thing too is, I think we also have to look, you mentioned population densities obviously is another issue, but I would also look at, we're an economically depressed county. I think that county incomes is something we have to look at, and maybe the demographics of the areas that we have our systems in. I know that's a lot of work, a lot of digging, but it's something I think we should try and keep in the back of our heads. Since we only have 370 sewer customers, it's a small number for ourselves to look at. So we might want to do a little bit of research on that end of it.
We'll definitely take a look. And just to clarify, especially for the sewer side, you'd like to see, because right now we're including basically an ongoing rate, which will include a capital surcharge. So the bar for some of these folks includes an operating and a capital surcharge. So you want to see what portion of the bar is capital versus operating. Okay, so that's just a clarification for myself. So right, so you'll hear, as you probably saw on the next slide, the sewer side. Here we're showing comparison again. Your neighbors, I would say Clallam PD is probably the most alike systems in terms of the comparisons to you that we have on the list. But we'll definitely look at a couple of other septic type of systems for our next time we meet comparison, and we'll break it out by charge component. Here you can see on the sewer side, you're quite a bit behind, just not even focusing on the septic type of system. Sewer is fairly much more expensive type of service than water we typically find in general. So you can see here, the lowest side of the equation here, we're at about $63 for the Clallam Sunshine Acres 2 system. Again, you'll see 2 systems from Clallam, and they do have a more expensive Southern View Estates system rate schedule published on their website. That one's around $103. That's including a capital surcharge for both. They both have one. Port Townsend rate, $82, does include a capital surcharge as well. So it's operating and a capital charge. And then the Port Angeles, they're a little unique. They have a combined sewer overflow charge because they're right on the water over there. So they do have some additional capital requirements, operating requirements, which they like to parse out on their own. But as you can tell in this comparison, you are also quite a bit lower than your neighbors right now. So we'll put together a couple additional either utilities, district, PUDs, or districts, maybe cities, just because the nature of your service is so unique in terms of the size, the type. So we'll want to align with the utilities that are most alike with you. So any additional questions for water or sewer before we move on to the electric utility?
I had an observation, and it's not my district because Port Townsend, the PUD is not providing sewer services in Port Townsend, but it is, and as Dan pointed out, it's like something like 370 customers or whatever it is, but they're a vocal set of customers, and I think we need to handle this carefully. I think we need to really think about why we're in the sewer business and really be careful on the examples we pull, because I will predict that when we have to adjust these rates, we're going to get some vocal, very knowledgeable, intelligent people coming in scrutinizing this, because their comparison will be to what their life was before the PUD came along. And that's not a fair comparison, because that situation, those situations could not continue for various reasons. So I think we're going to have to be really careful how we talk about why we're in the sewer business, that it's a public health issue, it's an economic development issue, and that the examples we use, we really have good information on them. So as Dan pointed out, they're apples to apples examples. And I'm going to probably advocate for continuing to kind of blend the rates together a little bit and not have the sewer customers have to cover their entire cost, at least, for further down the road, just because it's a public health issue. And in my opinion, we want people to be on safe septic. And I'll just stop there. But I think we have to handle this one carefully and not just throw it in the mix and think it's like everything else, because I think we have a little different subset of our customers, and we have to really be careful how we communicate this and be really clear.
Great, thank you. We'll keep that in mind for the next presentation. So now we'll transition to the electric utility. This should be fairly consistent with the water utility, so hopefully it'll be familiar. Here we have our revenue side projections for this utility. We were looking at, again, forecasting revenues using historical statistics. We evaluated actual data. We actually looked at weather normalization for this utility because it's quite a bit larger, and there's a big correlation for quite a few of the classes between weather, heating degrees, and consumption. We settled with going with the 2018 year and modified 19-year projection because that represented the most average year based on our historical evaluation of consumption as well as weather. So we're starting with a modified approach for our forecasting. We are forecasting in this case that the residential customers will be going up by about 1% per year. These are tied to the county population projections. It's a little under 1%, so I'm rounding here. But all other classes, the non-residential classes, are currently projected to stay constant. We're not foreseeing any growth in general service categories. We do have non-rate revenues on this utility as well, including interest income, timber revenue, and taxes, rent from property, miscellaneous revenues, and we're treating the PT mill, the pass-through customer, as a non-rate revenue because they are on a contract. They're basically as a wheeling customer. We're not going to be applying rates to them. If there is a rate action, they're going to be just simply following the Bonneville cost plus some administrative charges and the wheeling charge. So this time, again, we're just putting them in a different cost component for tracking purposes. So our revenues at current levels, assuming that 1% growth rate on residential customers, will range from about $38.6 million up to about $41.8 million in that 10-year horizon. On the operating maintenance expenses side, again, starting with the current budget, applying the various escalation factors ranging from 2 to 6%, we have a weighted average rate of about 2.5%, slightly less than the water side, but that's just due to the makeup of the expenses themselves between labor and general service type costs. Here, again, similar to the water utility, we are tracking and making sure we're including our revenue costs associated with the PUD accounts for both water and electric. So again, this utility is paying their share of costs. And we did make a small adjustment to the labor modification to the 2020 budget. So there were some labor negotiations occurring when the 2020 budget was developed. Those negotiations ended in 2020. So we incorporated the results of those negotiations into our analysis. So it modified the 2020 budget slightly by about 1% for labor. So overall, you can see that the makeup of our costs are again related mainly to distribution expenses of about $5.4 million. Administrative general is about 3.1. Customer account services 1.8. Taxes are about 2.2% of total costs, a pretty big portion of your expense of operating maintenance costs. And the transmission expense is very small, around 100,000 or less. Overall, about $12.7 million in O&M in 2020, projected to increase up to about $15.9 million by 2030. The next key component is capital. Here we've broken out by major type of components. So we started the forecast with the 4-year electric capital program available to the utility. After that, because we are trying to forecast in the future, talking with staff internally, we're estimating just an average of about $5.5 million per year in today's dollars to keep up with maintenance of costs. We're not forecasting any large one-time facility projects going on in the second part of the 10-year projection. So again, just for your reference, our initial 4 years is tying to the plan. After that, we're using an average per year projection cost estimate for future years. So in today's dollars, that's about 63.6 or $7 million. In inflated, escalated to the year of construction dollars, that's about $73.6 million. Now, there was a request during the fundamentals to go over what is TRM, what was the basis of tier rate methodology. So we have the next couple of slides that will go over kind of high level picture, trying to explain, hopefully, what is tiered rate methodology being charged to the PD and other wholesale purchasers from Bonneville Power Administration, how it's made up of, what was the purpose of it, at least in the beginning, and trying to interpret what it's doing. So just as a setup for the discussion, just to give you an idea, your total purchase power includes 2 cost components. The first component is the actual purchase of the electricity needed to provide service, which is strictly related to the tiered rate methodology. This part of your total bill, which is about 89% of your cost based on 2019 dollars, actual dollars paid, is the TRM. The second cost component is related to transmission, getting that energy to the PUD. That's about 11% of total cost. That'll be outside of the discussion. That's basically getting the energy to the door. So our focus is on that purchase power first cost component. So what is TRM? Basically, looking at the definition, it's a 2-tier priority firm, a rate design applicable to firm requirements, customers and publics. Basically, customers that rely fully on Bonneville, it's a rate charged by Bonneville to these type of customers. It went into effect in fiscal year 2012, which is October of 2011, since fiscal year starts in October of every year. And these rates are adjusted on a biennial basis or every 2 years. So in simple terms, what was the goal trying to interpret Bonneville, and what was the goal in switching to the TRM? Before TRM, it was a more straightforward approach. Energy you used, demand you put on the system was assessed at charge. Now there's quite a few different charges, which we'll look at in a minute, and it's a lot more complicated. So conceptually speaking, prior to the implementation of TRM, Bonneville or BPA secured energy or power for all its customers, wholesale customers, all the publics, which included low-cost hydropower based on the water availability for that hydro. And if they were deficient in providing power to everybody, they went to the market and they purchased market-based purchases to make up the difference, which resulted in a melded rate. Now, if you think back to early 2000s, even late 2000s, our energy costs on the market were substantially higher than our hydropower, especially during Enron times. So with that in mind, a lot of folks did not like the melded rate if they were already built out. So the communities that stopped growing, did not have a lot of expansion, did not want to pay for new communities coming online and having them to have this higher melded rate. So what Bonneville partially tried to accomplish through this is they basically unbundled their rate, they separated the low cost power, and they said, okay, folks, you can go to the market yourself to secure the remaining needs, or you can come to us and we can provide you an equivalent of market purchases. But basically, they're trying to unbundle the rates and make it more transparent. They also mentioned that they wanted to provide a cost basis for utilities to incentivize conservation. They wanted to, because again, if you think back during that time, that the secondary tier 2 power, what they called it, the more expensive power, was quite a bit more expensive than the low cost hydropower. So this would create a cost basis for utilities on a local level and distribution level to have a cost-based tiered rate. Now, again, this was pre the natural gas boom and what's happening today. So the methodology concepts at the time that they were developed might not be the same applicable as they are today. So that's kind of the rationale behind this methodology. Now let's take a quick look at the components. So in general, everybody will have the same 3 key components. All other utilities might have other ancillary type charges, small little fees, miscellaneous fees, some regulatory frequency fees, but mainly your bill for power will consist of 3 major components. The first one being the customer charge. And it's actually made up of a composite charge and a true-up non-slice charge, but overall everybody calls it a customer charge. Now, this charge was about 91% of your total bill for this cost component in 2019. This charge is fixed. This charge does not change with your consumption. This charge does not change with your peaking. For the 2-year period that you enter on a biennial basis, based on that 2019, 91% of your charges are fixed and not modifiable by you. The next cost component is related to load shaping charges. It's about 3% of your 2019 total bill. And this actually charge can be a credit or it could be a bill. It depends on how you follow the predicted system, hydro system availability of energy. And if you stay close to it, you will not have a bill at all. If you use more than they assume that you use, you will have a bill. If you use less than they assume you should use, you will have a credit to you. It's pretty complicated, but in general, this is an area where you can potentially have savings in your bill if you modify your usage behavior or you're using less than what was predicted. And finally, there's a demand charge component, which made up about 6% of your total bill in 2019. It's based on the 1-hour maximum demand consumption during Bonneville's peak. So it's not necessarily when the PUD is peaking that's important here, is what was the contribution from the PUD to when the Bonneville, all the utilities that provide service peaked at the same time. So it's a little bit of different of concept. Now, what they tried to do is during the time of the development, they wanted to capture 91% of demand costs in that customer charge. The remaining 9% would basically be available for customers to modify. So if you can reduce your demand, you can save some money here. But it's basically tied to 91% of each utility's historical peaks. And if I remember my information correctly, it went back for most utilities to 2006, 5, 6, 7, and maybe even 8 time period where they got those numbers. For you as a young utility, so to speak, they didn't have that information, so I'm not really sure how Bonneville established that component for you, but I'm sure they probably worked with PSC to get an idea of what the demands were for the area. And then they set the prices for demand based on a cost of running a gas-fired combustion turbine at that time. And I'm sure they're updating their information. That's more of a concept of marginal cost pricing, what would it cost to introduce a new resource to the market. So they basically said 9% of demand will be based on the marginal cost price peaking. They also recently introduced a new charge, a financial reserve policy surcharge. In 2019, it was about 0.2%. It was just the beginning of the charge. Overall, we're forecasting it would be about almost 2%, 1.8% of your total costs. And once you have a full year of those costs in place. Now, again, the nexus of this charge is Bonneville has policies too. Bonneville wants to make sure their reserves are met too. They're behind their reserves, and they're trying to replenish those reserves partly with this reserve surcharge. Now, due to COVID conditions, they've announced that they'll be suspending this charge during COVID. Dollar impact wise, it's not a substantial dollar, as you can see numerically up above, but they will be performing that action, or they already have performed that action. So the intent of Bonneville, I believe, was to provide an incentive for conservation, and that might have been more true during the cost of the very high market purchases. But right now, if you look at your composition of your expenses, 91% of your costs are fixed. So, what does this structure tell us is that it doesn't matter what happens to your load. If your load drops for some reason, we're having a mild year, you're going to have an impact on your revenues, while 91% of your power costs are not going to change. So that's a pretty substantial impact that you might want to consider as we get into the development of your actual rates assessed. We might want to look at aligning our fixed and variable rates to be at least somewhat representative of how Bonneville is assessing their fees onto us. So hopefully that gave you a good overview of TRM. If you wanted additional information, let me know, and we can talk offline as well if you want to know any more specifics.
Hey, Sergey, I just wanted to pause you there. That is that's probably the best presentation I've ever heard on BPA rates. So
well, thank you.
That was very 101, and I got it. And thank you very much. Quick question. You mentioned that 91% of the charge is fixed and it's based on our 2-year contract. I'm still presuming that 91% is based upon how much energy they're delivering on average to Jefferson PUD compared to Clallam PUD or compared to Mason PUD or someplace else. Would you say that's correct?
That's correct. So that's kind of the next layer, if you so to speak, of the onion. I try to stay pretty high level. The way that Bonneville established your share of that fixed charge is they looked at your tier 1 cost allocation. They call it abbreviated as TOCA. And they basically looked at each utility's need around 2011, 9 through 11 time period. And then they had a period of adjustment. But basically they said, based on your needs in the past, this is a threshold for your tier 1 low cost power. And what you need as a utility in relationship to all our customers, that'll be your allocation of that fixed charge.
Okay.
Every year, the federal system changes and produces less or more electricity, but they adjust the amount you get every year, but your TOCA stays fairly consistent year to year unless there's a big growth that occurs between you or some other customers. The TOCA can change a little bit here and there, but it is proportionate to your usage. It is tied to energy.
Okay, and then the next question, you mentioned that back when these were designed back in 2011, 2012, market rates were historically above federal hydro rates. And it sounds like what you're saying is today and in the recent past, that is not necessarily the case. Is that still true, that market rate power can be less than BPA federal hydropower?
Right. That's what we've been seeing is that market rates could be, melded in aggregate could be cheaper.
Okay. And then lastly, I don't know that you have a crystal ball or you're paying any attention to what BPA is saying, but from what you know, does it appear that this sort of methodology is most likely to follow into the next contract, or is it really too soon to know? Is there any indication of how they might structure it?
Unfortunately, I don't really know because those contracts are ending in 28, and they're going to be ramping up the negotiations of the approach and what other utilities are going to be doing probably in the next couple of years. So it's still a little bit far away to know what they're planning to do.
All right, thank you.
All right. So in terms of the big picture, how much is power overall of your overall expenses? Here, when we were forecasting the power, we did incorporate and forecast every single billing determinant that we found and aligned it as best as we could with our cost projections. We did look at and included the latest adopted fiscal year 2020, which were in effect October 2019 power and transmission actual rates. Because Bonneville does do rate adjustments every 2 years, we had to assume some sort of inflation factor. So we're assuming a 5% inflation cost in the cost of power and transmission for both every 2 years. So if you annualize it, that's slightly less than 2.5%. That's around with compounding. So that's about inflationary that we're assuming. Now, if you look at the Bonneville's last 4 or 5 rate actions, just going back to 11 or 12, 14, 16, 18, I remember increases of 9.5%, 7.5%, 5.5%, and the most recent one, because of a lot of the pressure they received, they developed their almost revenue neutral increase, although the way they structure it, each utility gets impacted differently. So it's very hard to predict what Bonneville is going to do. So we're planning for at least inflation adjustment in the next rate actions leading through the end of the contract. Now, in terms of dollars, we're forecasting power to be about $16.5 million, getting up to about $22 million for the utility. So on average, that's about 57% of your total operating maintenance expenses. So it's a fairly significant portion of your costs that are fixed pretty much in nature and you have no control over. So if you put everything together on this slide, you'll see the baseline results for the electric utility revenue requirement. Here, just like on the water side, the bars represent expenses made up of operating maintenance expenses at the dark color at the bottom. You'll see the power is quite a bit higher than those and a pretty big portion of the overall bar in orange, followed by your debt service in the gold. And you'll actually see that in this case, we have capacity in our rates to start funding some level of capital financing. So the blue portion is representative of how much cash we can generate to go towards our capital program. So unlike the picture we saw with the water utility, this utility, at least in the front end, can currently support all our needs plus some level of capital financing. As we do go out in the future, because our growth rate is below our cost of inflation and projects, we are the cost of inflation is outpacing revenues. So we are showing that by 27, we're not going to be able to meet our operating costs or debt service. But because you are an RUS borrower, we do have to track those policies for debt service coverage and tier. So we have modeled those indices without any rate action. So if you do nothing, you can sustain 3 of those matrices with our forecast of 24, but the operating tier ratio targeting 1.1 would dip below the target in 2022. So even though you're making your cash needs and supporting some level of capital funding, you will not be able to meet your coverage requirement, and you would have to have some rate action as based on this forecast at the latest by 2022 to comply with those tier requirements. Now, a good kind of segue would be for that House bill discussion, allowing you to refinance to lower interest rate. As you can see, debt service in the yellow is a substantial portion, not quite a bit as large as O&M or power, but it is a portion of your costs, saving $1 million here per year, if I remember that correctly from the statement earlier in the discussion of the board meeting. That could definitely assist in providing more capacity to pay for capital or to go towards the deficiency down the line. Now, bringing in the capital side of the equation, that $76 million we saw a couple of slides ago, you'll notice that we're starting the utility with balances above our policy targets. Now, the utility also has access up to $5 million of a line of credit to help meet the operating policy. So this does not include that line of credit to meet our policies, but we did take that line of credit into consideration when developing and assessing our rate strategies. So you'll notice that our current balances, especially once we incorporate those tax proceeds, are above our targets and above $10 million together. So to answer that question before, if we have enough funds available to provide to borrow, interfund borrow up to $5 million to the water utility, So this shows that we do. So if we start using up those reserves to pay for capital, without any rate action, we can go through 2022 before going negative and basically not able to build any capital after that. So how do we resolve our deficiency? Because both of our water scenarios were tied directly to borrowing interfund loans from the electric utility, we had to run the same two scenarios as a starting discussion point. So here we're looking at an interfund loan of $1.6 million to the water utility and then a $5 million interfund loan. In either case, we're able to do these options without any debt service. So 100% cash finance capital plan for both of these scenarios. So in scenario one, with a smaller borrowing, we're looking for slightly above inflation annual rate increases of about 4%. That's again to meet our cost inflation, our projects, and bond bill increases that we have estimated in our forecast. After that first 3 years, we would be looking at more inflationary 2.5s, and and through the end of 28 bond bill contract period. So significantly different picture from the water utility. On the $5 million option, because we're not going to have as much cash to pay and offset some costs, we would need to bump those rates up a little bit, up to 5.5 for 2 years, and then more inflationary 2.25 thereafter. So either option scenarios do have front end needs, and then revert to more inflationary adjustments to keep up with the cost of inflation thereafter. Here, the average bill currently for a typical residential home using 1,000 kilowatt hours is about $114. Under scenario one, you would see an increase up to $5 per month before going to $3 or so per month per year thereafter. And then under scenario two, you'll be under $7 per month for the first 2 years, and then be under $3 at around $3 per month per year thereafter there. So in terms of the scenario, we did the same survey comparison for the electric utility. Again, I want to caution that it's never apples and apples just because everybody's so different. We can get as close as we can, but even policy decisions by those utilities policymakers will make these comparisons a little bit apples and oranges. Here, in this case, we're somewhere in the middle of the pack. Based on the comments that we heard from you, we can also add a couple comparatives here as well, taking into account demographics, how rural or urban the utilities are. But in our initial neighboring communities, we're seeing that we're somewhere right in the middle of the pack under the current rates.
And Sergey, this is a tough one because those other utilities have all been around for a really long time. And we're this new utility, relatively new, that's capitalized with this big loan that's $6 million a year, and that's
right
reduction. So, and I think that's too fine a thing to try and slice and explain in all this. But for me, it's just kind of a footnote that we're not going to be the cheapest rates because we just built our house and
right
in the early stages of paying off our mortgage compared to some of these other guys.
Right, exactly. So it's definitely an apples and oranges, and once that mortgage is paid off, you're going to have a lot more capacity to improve and expand your system more robustly. But so it's going to be very tricky to find a comparative that's very close to you, because a lot of utilities, as you mentioned, have been around for a long time.
A couple of dynamics too that you might look at when you break this down for us, Sergey, is do they generate some of their own energy, whether it's solar or they have hydro or whatever, depending on who you go to and look at. But also the amount of debt to asset ratio, like Jeff was kind of speaking to a little bit. I think we need to kind of look at what other people have for debt, might tell you a little bit why their rates are the way they are.
Yeah, we definitely want to be cautious because we don't want to compare ourselves to somebody like Chelan PD, who has access to substantial generation resources that they can resell on a wholesale resale market. Douglas as well, Grand PD. Those are utilities. They're just different. They're unique on their own right. They're very large. So again, we don't want to compare to those, but we will try to see who we can find who's in a similar position as you are, and maybe has a little bit more leverage than that, if we can find that information readily through.
And even
It would,
oh, go ahead, Ken.
it would be nice to know what effect the closing of the coal strip power plants in Montana will have on PSE's rate. We've always looked at that as a benchmark for us, given that one of the selling points of taking over the electric utility was to have very competitive, if not lower rates. So I wonder, Sergey, if you have any idea of how that's going to impact PSE's rates looking ahead.
That's a tricky one for PSC because they're an IOU, they're regulated, they have to go to Washington Commission to get approved any rate action. So that one, unfortunately, is a little hard to predict in terms of how and what kind of action they'll be allowed to do if that were to happen.
The only thing I was going to add was on Dan's point that I hadn't thought of that debt to asset ratio as a really simple number to find, because every utility's got it, or at least our US borrowers have to do it. I don't know how hard it would be to find from the other PUDs, but that number kind of explains it. It says we're leveraged, you know, higher than others, and we're paying more in debt. So anyway.
Most utilities at the time of the year don't always publish those because they're being audited, so they're in an audit process. So we can see if we can find some data. Most of them will have at least a year or two behind. So we'll definitely see if we can find that information when we update the survey next time we see you, and then the next utilities that we'll bring in front of you. Great. So in the looping everything together, we presented preliminary findings from you. What we're looking for is some feedback and direction. So in terms of timing of the increases, levels, scenarios of the increases, anything else that you'd like to see, because this is an important critical step for us, because before we can bring you back step 2, cost of service and equity between classes, we pretty much have to settle on an option. We don't have to be fully there, but we need to have step 1 finalized before we can show you the results of step 2. So again, any kind of options that you'd like us to see, this table just simply brings back the alternatives we showed you, scenario 1 and 2 for the water utility, potentially separating sewer, and we heard Commissioner Randall, your comments about the sewer utility, and then the electric utility potentially having a rate action in 21 with 4 to 5% increases. So what is everybody's thoughts and and maybe you might need some time to think about it as well.
So Sergey, did you present the scenarios which combine water and sewer to show us what the rate increases would look like?
So the scenarios I presented originally for the water and the ones you're looking at the top, these assume water and sewer combined. So
okay,
again,
thank you.
Yeah, our baseline assumes they're combined.
I'm probably in a different camp than Jeff. I'd like to see sewer stand on its own a lot sooner maybe than what these projections look at. If maybe there's a third option, I don't know what that would look like myself at this point. So that's one of the things. If we're going to take a big water rate increase, I'd hate to do a big sewer increase and a big water increase. So I don't know how that's going to look, how that plays out. I think we're still too early in the game to know what that's going to look like.
Okay. Any other options you'd like us to develop, or at this time kind of continue forward with developing the cost of service, and then maybe you'll think about it and provide us feedback as we go?
I'd like to get a copy of the presentation.
Okay.
Lots to digest, and I think I would echo what Kevin has said. I think you guys have done a magnificent job of trying to show us behind the curtain what's involved numbers, and I really appreciate that, because it puts the power back in our hands to, when we're setting rates, to explain them, and I realize that it'll get deeper as we go into comparing classes and so forth, but I appreciate the detail that you've provided.
And I would echo what Commissioner Randall has said, Sergey. I really appreciate the comprehensive nature of your presentation. It's not happy news, but I think it's the reality that we face, and that's what we have to deal with. So there are going to be some difficult choices ahead for the utility.
Well, and then going back a few slides, I'm not asking you to go back there. I'm just thinking of the electric division, and when you broke out the different categories of the electric division, the different slices, the biggest increase is not BPA, it's not transmission, it's not construction, it's our employee costs. So some of this stuff is what it takes to do business in a rural area and have talented people and so forth. So when we get down to the bottom line of, we set rates and we're explaining to people how much their bills are going to go up, it's a complex story, and a lot of the money is coming back again to the people that are making sure they've got service and that the power's on, and then when they need a hookup, they do it quickly and efficiently. So it's, as Ken's pointing out, yeah, there's rare that you look ahead in the future and you see, oh, things are getting cheaper, I'll have more money in my pocket. It's like things get more expensive, but I think explaining what people are getting for their money, and this money, a lot of it's staying here. You're paying rates, a lot of it's staying here, getting reinjected into the economy. And if we can, as we were discussing with Representative Kilmer, if we can be showing how this PUD is making a positive difference in other ways in this county, I think it's a complex, good story. And if it comes down to somebody having $13 more or something in their bill in a month, but they see what we're getting for it, the whole story, I think that's going to be really important.
So yeah, and thanks Sergey for your presentation. Great job, and to your team. So the staff want to weigh in at all at this point, Kevin?
So I think moving forward, as we look at individual rates and stuff, some hard decisions have to be made. The part of the component that I'm just throwing out here today, and Sergey and his team and our teams talked, these are fully funding the capital projects. So if we pull back a little bit on capital, it gives us some room to do some things. And I'm just throwing this out there, with COVID-19, a lot of PUDs had increases scheduled to go into effect right now. They pulled back. So throwing that out there, we do have, this is fully funded. This shows everything that we want to do, and in the long term, we need to do. But there is a little bit of some options that we can talk about as far as capital, not the expense side, but the capital side.
And Kevin, that may actually get to kind of Dan's split the baby or split the rate idea, some more flexibility in the assumptions, or at least on the timing of some things. So I would appreciate some thought being given to that, especially with the times that we're having right now.
So is there anything else on this topic, or are we ready to put this one to bed? I'm not hearing or seeing any questions. So again, I would say thank you. Unless there's anything else from FCS, we'll move on.
I would just like to thank you for your time, and thank you the staff for just working with us, getting us all the data in a very fast manner, and just working through all the questions that we have. We really appreciate it.
Thanks,
Staff
Good-
would like
good
to thank
presentation.
FCS. They've done us a great job. We enjoy working with them. They really have done a lot of work. Thank you.
All right, with that, I think we will move on. Thanks again, FCS.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
You too. So item number 4 on the agenda is public comment. The public comment period is for any item not specifically listed on the current agenda or for items listed on the consent agenda. The chair may place time limits on public comments to allow the meeting to be conducted in an efficiently and orderly manner. Speakers will have 3 minutes, 1 time each. Stating your name would help for the audio record, but it's not required. And public comment will also be taken during the old and new business sections of the agenda. So with that, I will open us up for public comment. Any takers? Are you seeing anybody, Will? All right, well,
This is Gary Rowe. Make a comment?
go ahead, Gary.
2 comments. First one is, listen, in the presentation, there was a reference to the capital plan for electric, which included a line for communications. That line showed for 2021, I believe, 140,000. In the budget presentation a week ago, there was a discussion regarding paying for broadband with 550,000 roughly in taxes to be collected in 2021. So is there an inconsistency, I guess, in the presentation in terms of how much money is being allocated in the capital budget for broadband? Because I only see a figure that shows communications for 140,000 in 2021. So that's the first comment. The second comment is regarding reserves. You had a presentation from staff a couple of weeks ago regarding the allocation or the ability to collect taxes inside Port Townsend for because they provide their own water service, is my understanding. So the question that I had raised at the time was that 70% of the taxes that are collected by the PUD are outside of Port Townsend. The question I thought I'd like to see an answer to is that if 70% of the taxes are collected outside of Port Townsend, can that 70% of the taxes go to any service that is provided by the PUD? It could be water, could be whatever they decide to, but is it not restricted in the same way that taxes that are collected inside the city of Port Townsend? So that's a question I think that would make a big difference in terms of how this scenario goes forward if that question was answered. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Does anybody have any answers for Gary at this point in time, or is it something we need to do more exploring on?
I can explain a little bit. The 145,000 is in the 4-year work plan. That is for the electric portion of line extensions, for example, to connect a substation, line equipment and stuff like that. Is just, it would be used in conjunction with the broadband. But on the broadband in the 2020 budget that was referred to by FCS and presented to the board, we are recommending that 500,000 be used for the taxing money for broadband. So we're his specific line item was the 4-year work plan. It was not the 500,000 from taxing revenues. As far as legally what we can do, percentages, you know, we've got questions out with the state auditor, the treasurer's office, and those kind of things. We have not had answers back. And we do believe there is some of that funds that could be used for certain things, but we're being very cautious right now because we're not sure what the powers that be were going to tell us we can and can't do.
Kevin, can I follow up on that too? At least in terms of the reserve, I agree with your last statement completely. There are funds that from property taxes that can be used for the water department, and excuse me, the case that we were involved in sort of maps out what that is, but it's really for non-standard water utility uses. And I'm happy to work with you. I'm curious if the auditor has some more thoughts on how we can apply the statute, but I've applied it in a very conservative way. And we got in trouble once before with this, and I just think that means that we need to tread lightly and be careful about how we use property tax funds derived from the city of Port Townsend residents. So we're still working on that issue, and I'm happy to, be more educated on it and draw a finer line on it as we go through this process.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks, Kevin. So any other public comment at this time? Seeing or hearing none, we'll close public comment. We have the ability later on to speak to the individual items as they come up. So with that, we will move on to item number 5, the consent agenda. All matters listed below on the consent agenda are considered under one motion and will be enacted by one motion. There will be no separate discussion on those items. If discussion is desired, that item will be removed from the consent agenda by a commissioner and will be considered separately. So, is there any additions or corrections to the consent agenda at this time? Not seeing anything from my commissioners.
I have no
So,
changes.
okay, with that, I would entertain a motion to accept the consent agenda as presented.
So moved.
I'll second that.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, so it's unanimous. Consent agenda passes. Item number 6, manager and staff reports. This is for information only and does not require any votes. You're muted, Kevin.
How's that?
That's better.
Thank you. Today we met with BPA, pre-construction meeting for the fiber in South County. We're moving forward with that. The next item I would like to talk about is, we've looking at some budget. We presented a preliminary budget to the commissioners. If there's specific things the commissioners would like to see or not see, I have gotten some information back. We would like to get another presentation to the board in approximately a week. And so I will be available. We can do some things, but if I had a little bit more information from the commissioners, we could massage the budget a little more detail coming up at the next meeting. So if maybe the next meetings I have with each commissioner, if you could give me your ideas, we could try to incorporate some of this into the budget. So we're, as staff, a little better prepared for the next budget meeting, which is next week.
So Kevin, along this budget, one of the issues that I had kind of was curious about was this transfer of unrestricted funds from the old, from the water side of the ledger to the electric. Do we have any kind of numbers on what that's going to be or how that's going to look and what the timing on that is? That will play into what the budget's, what we're going to do with the budget, I would think.
Make sure I'm not muted. We're still working on that. Basically, what we're saying is it's in reserves. This whole thing came about because in 18, it was moved to water without board or anyone's approval. We're moving to move it forward. And this is just me. I'm seeing it as part of our reserves, and whether it's water, power, I know it makes a big difference, but right now it's reserves for both sides of the PUD, and we're using it as such. I do know on the loan, we have to charge a little bit of interest, but we're getting almost nothing from the state treasurer's office, the money we have there. So if we match the nothing that we're getting from the treasurer's office, I believe that falls within the guidelines of what Olga Moss Adams is going to say we have to do. And that's a known entity. We can say the treasurer's getting 0.52%, then that means the water has to pay 0.52%, something along those lines. So there's a lot of things at play. Staff is working really hard. We have Joel working overtime on some of these issues. There's a lot going on. I know it didn't quite answer the questions, but we're trying to come up with answers.
And Kevin, I had a question. It sounded like what you were asking the commissioners to do is between now and the next time we meet on budget to individually share with you how I'm interpreting that is if we have any questions that we need answered or additional information that we need at that meeting to let you know before that meeting so staff can be prepared. Is that an accurate way to say what you were requesting?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
And it may be as simple as staff has made a recommendation to spend the tax money for broadband.
Right.
That may not be what you folks want to do, staff's recommendation, but those are things where you could come back and say, no, or, let's look at options.
Got it.
Anything that.
And I just wanted to make clear that some of those discussions need to happen in the meeting. They need to happen in the light of day, and we can't be, giving you our individual opinions outside the meeting. But I think anything that relates to, hey, Kevin, for me to make a decision on this in that meeting, you're going to have this as part of your presentation. I think that's the relevant stuff. But some of that stuff, I think we have to talk about in the meeting.
Correct.
Yeah, that's why I was curious about that particular topic that I asked about, so we all kind of knew where we were headed with that. And the money on the broadband, the property tax going to the broadband, that's another one I'm still beating around a little bit, whether that money should just go right into the electrical side of the ledger and then see what we really need for projects on the broadband side before we actually just say that we're going to put it all into broadband. That may not necessarily be the way we'll have to go or would want to go. So was that it, Kevin?
Yes, we're trying to keep things short because we have some other topics and trying to get out.
Okay. So with that, we will move on to item number 7, which is old business. And please hold public comment until each presentation is done. And before there's any potential vote, we'll allow you to chime in. So with that, we have item 7.1, the GEFCOM interlocal agreement. And actually, before we get going on that, Will, I know we had Russ Michaels, member of the CAB, sent in some comments on this. Maybe we should read his comments first.
I have that here. I can read it if that's what you would like.
Yeah, let's do that. In case that's a question that someone else has, we'll just get it out right at the front here.
Okie doke. Hello, commissioners. I won't be able to attend tomorrow night's virtual BOC meeting, but would like to offer the following public comment regarding the GEFCOM interlocal agreement. To support 911 emergency services and dispatch, one of the GIS datasets are accurate site addresses. One of the datasets are accurate site addresses and nearest cross streets. If this data set has errors, the dispatch of emergency services may take longer or even be dispatched to the wrong location. If there were a lawsuit filed against GEFCOM for a slow response time or wrongful death due to any GIS database error, the PUD will want to make absolutely certain that any liability does not flow down to the PUD. Also, just to clarify, a GIS, geographic information system, is not inherently an engineering solution. It's a database of location-based information and analytic tools to analyze the data. Maps and/or reports are the typical outputs of the GIS. Thank you for listening and considering this public comment as you finalize the GEFCOM interlocal agreement. Kind regards, Russ Michael, CAB Chair.
Thanks, Will. As we discuss this, that might be something that someone would want to address or maybe not address. So with that, I'll throw it back to Kevin or to Joel, whoever's going to lead this discussion.
Well, we presented the draft last meeting. There was some concerns about to make sure that if the PUD is helping them, that we don't run our staff to the point where they can't help us. So thanks to Joel, a lot of that language was changed, and pretty, I believe it addresses the issue where we will only help if it's good for the PUD, helps the community, and we have the resources to do so. And with that, I'll throw it over to Joel on the legal side of things. I kind of disagree with Russ, but Joel, he's the lawyer. He can tell us exactly if we're covered. I think we are with this agreement. We have the whole harmless in there. So,
Yeah.
But let's Joel address it.
Nope, counselor, I think you did a good job. And yeah, it's covered. That's why we have a mutual hold harmless. If they screw up for any reason and we get dragged into a lawsuit, they're required to defend us and hold us harmless. Equally, if we do, we have to hold them harmless. If we're ever found to have made a mistake, that's why we have insurance. That's why PERMS is out there. So I feel confident we're covered in that regard. And I think the details that we spoke to improve the agreement last time have been included in the agreement you have. So.
Yeah, Joel, I was fine with this. It really the rewrite looked really good. I didn't see anything with it that concerns me at this point. I'm good with it.
Yeah, I'll say the same thing. I read the whole thing and I thought it was extremely clear. I think it is clear who's managing the people and how it all works, and that the requests need to be in writing and the hold harmless and everything else. I feel very comfortable with it too. I'm ready to approve it once we get to that point.
And I'd like to add, I'm also comfortable with it. And the one exclusion that was passed by the PERMS board having to do with service level agreements, I think does not apply to the situation. So I don't, in the unlikely event that we were included in a lawsuit, I feel comfortable, and Joel, correct me if I'm wrong, that PERMS would cover us.
Yeah, I don't see that NOAANET sort of SLA issue arising here. I mean, the services we're providing are really standard PUD type services, and so I'm sure we would be able to get any sort of coverage from PERMS.
So with that, unless there's anything else from staff, doesn't appear to.
So Dan, real quick, what we'd like to do is bring this as a resolution back. Can it go in the consent agenda for next meeting?
Yeah, that's good. So I was going to ask at this point if there was any public comment on this. Now's your time to speak up, because it will be coming, like Kevin said, on the consent agenda next time around. All right, I'm not seeing or hearing anything. So with that, I think we will, staff has all the direction they need, correct? Okay. With that, we will move on to item number 8, new business B, 8.1, NOAANET membership update.
So I put this on the agenda based on the last NOAANET meeting that that I attended. Commissioner Collins was there also. NOAANET is looking, I got to grab my notes here. NOAANET is looking to do some long-term financing. And I applaud them. They need to do some long-term financing. They've ran into an issue with the bank that they've been dealing with for a long time, and it's getting harder and harder for them to borrow money. Part of it is how they borrow the money. I'll get into that in a little bit. They're borrowing the money based on NOAANET being self-sufficient versus borrowing the money as an association of PUDs. And how that affects is there would be additional paperwork if the PUDs would guarantee the loans, but it makes a huge difference on interest. And the interest that they're talking about, and one of the recommendations NOAANET made was they would like to go out for a bond. At a AA rating, the bond would be 1.8%. To get that, that means that all the PUDs would have to guarantee the bond. If not, they would be a BB rated bond, and the interest rate would be 4.25%. So that's a huge difference. There was a lot of discussion with NOAANET members on how, good or bad. I told the NOAANET meeting group that I would come back to at least our board and talk about it. They need an answer in September. We'll have one more meeting before the NOAANET board meeting. So this is just an update. At present, NOAANET's made up of 9 PUDs and Energy Northwest. Each company has approximately, not approximately, each company has a different percentage of ownership into NOAANET. NOAANET, the Benton has approximately 20%. Jefferson County owns approximately 1%. How that's been viewed on in the past is that if NOAANET would go belly up, Benton would owe 20%, PUD would owe 1%. For really NOAANET and the group to move forward, they're requesting, and I firmly believe all of us have to step up here, that every PUD would own 10% of the company. And not own, we would be responsible for 10%. If they go out to bonds, Benton, who owns or has 20% in NOAANET, they wouldn't even attempt to go out of bonds unless we all come to an equity position. That sounds like a big stretch, but it's really not. We've already loaned NOAANET some money, and at that, every PUD went ahead and said, okay, we're going to loan it at the 10%. We all agreed back then. This is just an extension of that. With the 10% ownership and the possibility that we would back the long-term loan or bonds, it really gives NOAANET some options to move forward with not only bonds, but maybe cheaper bank money, those kind of stuff. This was not a unanimous position. Other PUDs felt that maybe now is not the time for NOAANET to be borrowing money. I kind of disagree a little bit there. I think NOAANET is making money. This is the best year they've ever had, and they need to secure some long-term financing. They don't want to see the same presentation our water department saw today 2 years from now. So, I really do think we need to look at all of the options. I do think that we need to step up and say, yes, we would buy into the 10% of NOAANET. It's really a paper chase, and then agree to terms on either doing construction internal to the PUD in our service territory, stepping up for banking and say, yes, you can use the PUD's combined credits for loans, or if it comes back that their board feels they should do bonds, that again, we would step up and say, okay, we are 10% owner of NOAANET, and we will step up and use our bond rating as part of the determining factor to who, at what interest rate they get it. There is work the PUD would have to do on our side. Our finances would have to be stated a little separately. I will tell you this, in the bond market, per covenants, they're going to have several $1 million in reserves. And if they do go belly up, the assets in Noanet are much more than the amount of money they're going to be borrowing here. So I feel the PUD is at very, very little risk. And with everything going on, I just see our relationship getting closer and closer with Noanet. And this is an important step in kind of pushing that relationship forward. Again, it's a board decision, but I think it's time for us to say, okay, we are a part of Noanet. We're a full-fledged member, and we need to think and work accordingly. So that's kind of my little spiel. Is there any questions?
So Kevin, one of the questions that came to my mind first was our RUS loan requirements, where we could conceivably be in a position of having some debt thrown on us. Is there any kind of considerations there we should be looking at or thinking about?
For the amount of loan here and our 10%, no, it would not affect us. It's really how you stated on your financial forms. It's not like a line item that we were actually liable against the 10% of the 15 million they want to borrow. It's how you actually line it up in your finances. So I will get you a better answer for that. If the board is at all interested, we can ask if one of the Noanet people can come to the next board meeting and give some of the same slideshow, condensed version of what they gave their board and the managers that attended the Noanet meeting. So there is additional work, Dan, but not where it would affect our RUS bond or borrowing.
So Kevin, I'm kind of curious as to the state of the question right now. Is the state of the question you're asking us if we support going to 10%, or is the state of the question there's an opportunity, there's a big discussion going on, would you like more information so that we can weigh in on this in an informed way? Is it really kind of, are we interested in more information, or what? I guess I'm not quite clear on the question that you're asking us.
To me, it's a two-part question. I don't want to bring Noanet in if we're definitely not even interested in it. I believe we should be. I think it's a path forward. And if we're at all interested, at the very least, we'll get their slideshow. We will present their information. But, I feel strongly we should do it. Board decision, but I don't want to waste their time either. So we're looking for some feedback.
Okay. And a follow-up question. You said that it's not unanimous that Noanet and the PUD should go this direction. Did you sense that anyone could potentially leave Noanet based on this? Is it that kind of decision, or probably not that sort of decision? If things don't go the way they want it, if everybody said 10% except one or two guy outfits, would they likely pull out of Noanet? Is it that kind of a issue?
I don't feel it was that kind of issue. To me, the issue became a lot of them have 8 or 12%, so their change isn't huge. The one that is the absolute lowest is the PUD. It is a huge lift for us.
Okay.
It is a downward for Benton and a couple others. So that part I didn't get any sense that there's a big issue there. There was some discussion on, is now the right time to look at long-term financing and borrow money. Historical low rates, I don't know if there's not a better time. So,
and then I guess lastly, from what you're saying, it really sounds like this is kind of a transformational time for Noanet. I mean, it wasn't that long ago when we were worried about them surviving, and there was lots of questions of us pulling out and different things like that. And what you're saying is they've changed their business model. There's been cultural changes at Noanet. They're making money now, but to continue on this growth opportunity, they need to have secure money that's affordable. And this is what you think is the best opportunity to do that.
I believe so. Yes. Okay. And they really are doing well financially right now.
Okay. Well, just speaking for myself, I am interested in learning more, and I do not have a big blind spot that says, heck no, I don't want to do this. This is, I'm interested in learning more.
Kevin, I think that it would be good to have either Dave Spencer or the gentleman who did the presentation talk with us. I think it's complicated because there are really two issues involved. One is the PUD's increasing its share of NOAANET, and I don't know what the financial implications of that would be. And the other that is a little bit clearer is our guaranteeing a bond that NOAANET might put out on the market. My understanding was that they want to have over a period of I think it's 10 years, something like $25 million available through bond funding. Now, it's true that over the last year, NOAANET's income has increased 158%. And looking at 2 years ago, their operating income has increased 200%. So they're on a different trajectory than they were before. And as far as the quality of work that they've done, looking at the 911 system across the state of Washington that they took over, they virtually have had 0 failures. They have, yes, thank you, Jeff. And if you take it out to 6 digits to the right of the decimal point, it is still 0 in terms of any time that the system has gone down. So that gives me a strong sense of confidence in the technical capability of NOAANET. And there's one thing that has been hypothetical in the 20 years that NOAANET's been in existence, and that is the companies that own shares of NOAANET, if NOAANET reaches a point of being significantly profitable, then the PUD owners will get a share of that profit. Now, that's not where they are today, but that is where they could be. Now, what's the level of risk in terms of our investing in NOAANET? I think we need to support them for other reasons than looking at a potential return on our investment. But having been involved for the last nearly 2 years on the NOAANET board, I think the right thing to do is for us to increase our share. We're actually less than 1%. We're about 1/4 of 1% ownership. And that doesn't give us a lot of clout in terms of our representation on the board, because periodically we get reminded of our stake in the enterprise. So again, I think it would be very, very useful for us to have somebody from NOAANET give us a presentation, be available for us to ask questions, and reach a level of sufficient comfort to go forward.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with finding out more about this, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if they're a little worried about us getting in late and cheap at this point. As to Ken's point, maybe might be part of the argument that's going on out there. So having said that, though, there is one other thing that you had here, Kevin, that I would like more information on. I'm guessing that if we get a presentation, they might talk about it, and that's the point you made about how projects that could be scheduled or potentially scheduled in our area, we may have to cover the cost. What exactly is that alluding to? How would that fit into this, buying in equally, and still, is that another component that we would have to do, or is that all part of the buy-in?
Kevin, you're muted.
You're muted.
One of, or part of the options that NOAANET talked about, they would not borrow as much money if all of the PUDs agreed to fund the projects in their service territory. And to some PUDs, that's a pretty heavy lift. most of the work in Jefferson County, the PUD has funded, other than some work out on the Hoe. But lately, we've been participating with labor and equipment on the Hoe. So if they would choose that option, it would just mean they would borrow less money, and then the PUDs would build and own the infrastructure in their service territory. So,
But go ahead, Ken.
Dan, it's as I understood it, it's an alternative to using a bond for financing. And again, I don't know the implications for our PUD if that were the alternative that is decided upon by the NOAANET board. But we would need to ask some questions about that, and whether that be to our advantage or not, I'm not sure. And I'm also not sure how much it would be to NOAANET's advantage for the board, their board, to settle on that alternative. I think that's probably a good deal more restrictive and laden with obstacles than they're being able to go out into the bond market and have the money that they need to pursue various opportunities that allow them to continue to grow.
All right. So do you have enough direction, Kevin, then to maybe one of those meetings, those 20 some odd meetings we got coming up? This will be one of those topics we'll address.
Can I?
yes, there is real quick, there is a time frame involved here. So it will be at one of the next meetings very quickly.
Okay. Go ahead, Joel.
I'd just like to suggest a couple things. I mean, one, it'd be really great if NOAANET had some sort of term sheet that they could put forward to you so that you could actually see what the terms are, you know, what changes are being made to their structure to, you know, sort of levelize everybody's investment. And I guess the other thing that on your behalf, you know, it's a little bit like a business plan. I mean, what, you know, if they're going to borrow $25 million and you're going to be 10% owner, how are you going to get paid back over time? You know, I'm sure that Dave and his team have thought about that, and that's probably part of the presentation. But I just think for your purposes, it'd be really important to take a look at that. I do know, and the other thing on our side of the ledger, you know, we're going to want to see what effect that actual guarantee of funds has on your, you know, debt service ratio, if it does, things like that. Those are just, you know, a couple issues that come to my mind off the top of my head.
Yeah. Thanks, Joel. So anything further on this topic? You have enough direction then, Kevin, right? Saw the thumbs up. All right. Any public comment on this topic at this point? You seen anybody on the phones there, Will? It's *6 to unmute if you're on the phone. All right. So we will be looking for that on one of our next agendas or our next meetings. We'll move on to item number 9, Commissioner reports. Commissioner Collins, you want to go?
Do I want to go where?
Wherever the conversation takes.
I'd like to go and have dinner, but let me give you my report briefly. August 5th and 6th, I was on the line for the Public Power Council meetings. On the 10th, I had a conversation with Kevin. I attended with the rest of you on the 11th, the budget meeting. The 12th, I was part of the NOAANET board meeting and had a conversation with Kevin on the 13th. looking ahead on the 19th, which I guess is tomorrow, I will be part of a JBAT meeting in the morning, followed by the Waputa Telecom Committee meeting. Looking forward to our meeting on the 25th, again, to revisit the budget. There's a JBAT meeting that I plan on attending on the 28th, and then on the 31st, another meeting with Kevin. And that's my report.
Thank you. You want to go, Jeff?
Sure. Mine is short. Had a meeting with Kevin on the 7th. On the 11th, attended the PUD special budget meeting. On the 13th, our intergovernmental work group on jobs and the economy met and had a good meeting. I think we have enough information to put together a draft report for the next bigger meeting of that group. On the 21st, I've got a meeting with Kevin, and then on the 25th, I'll be at that same PUD meeting that Ken mentioned, the special meeting we've got scheduled, the budget one. That's it.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I'll make mine pretty brief too. I attended the PPC meetings on the 5th and the 6th. And the one thing on the 6th that came up was they're going to be electing a new board of directors for PPC. And we'll actually be, have some voice in that process. So I don't know whether we want to talk about that now or not worry about it. Commissioners, or Jeff, did you listen to the PPC meetings?
I was not able to participate in this round, no, unfortunately.
Okay, so Ken, you're probably aware of what I'm alluding to as far as whether we wanted to nominate someone, and then we'll have a couple votes when the ballot, a slate of nominees comes out. Do we have any preferences or anything that we want to talk about with that?
I don't have any preference, and I certainly don't have a burning desire to be on another board. I don't know about you or Jeff, but now PPC board is made up to a large extent of general managers of cooperatives and PUDs. So, Kevin, if this is something you have any desire to throw your hat in the ring, I would support you, but I'm not encouraging you to do so.
Hey, Dan, what's the deadline on the nominations? Can you share more about the process?
I think it's about a week and a half. At the PPC meeting was the 6th and 7th, and it was a 3-week window. So definitely before the end of this month. Kevin, I'm good with letting Kevin basically, think this thing through and respond on our behalf if we don't have any burning issues, as far as a nomination or, how we want to vote on that ballot. When it's kind of a convoluted process. You rank the people that are on that slate when it comes out, and then the top 20 or 21 vote getters would be the ones that are nominated. So the order that you mark those in has more meaning than who the people necessarily are. And there's some automatic buy-ins to PPC. If you don't get enough votes, there's certain entities that kind of get an automatic backdoor in to, and this is my understanding of it, and it was my first time of hearing of this process. So I'm good with letting Kevin kind of handle this process unless you guys, want to do it differently.
Mm-hmm. I need to think about it a little bit more. I know Clallam, I think, wasn't Will Purser on that board, and they've been booted. I don't know if they've taken any more action to try and join again or what the status on that is. It's interesting to think about. So it sounds like basically people put their names forward, and then there's a voting that ranks them is kind of how the whole thing works.
That was my understanding.
Okay. Well, thanks for sharing that. I'll think about that. But
I wanted to bring it to your attention in case I figured Ken might have heard it since he'd listened. I wasn't sure, but I don't remember if you were on that call.
But thank you for bringing that up.
Okay.
And Dan, if I'm correct, it's a 2-step process. There's a nomination process, and then after the nomination process, then there's a voting process. So it's kind of if we want to nominate someone, we have to. I don't think, unless one of the commissioners want to do it, staff, we just have too much going right now. Then the ballots come back to say, okay, these are the people that are nominated. How do you rank them?
Right. That was my understanding. And that vote takes place in October or November PPC meeting. So the first one was the 3-week period to nominate, and then it goes to they're going to rank them and do whatever and take those votes, and then those people would be designated or installed later on in the year, October, November. All right. So where was I at here? I met with the general manager on August 7th. Then I attended the staff presentation on the draft 2021 budget. And let's see, on the 19th, I will meet with the general manager. I will attend the JPD special meeting on the 25th, and I will listen in on the JEFCOM meeting on the 27th. So that's my report. So with that, any other public, I'll ask one more call for any other public comment. I don't know who we still all have on the line. Is there any further public comment? *6 if you're on the telephone. Anything, Will? All right. So with that, unless there's anything else for the good of the order, I haven't overlooked anything. It is 7:35, and I will put us into adjournment. Thank you, one and all. A lot of business
Thanks.
tonight.
You.
Thanks, great meeting.
Thanks, everybody.